On a stormy night in November 1971, a man strapped $200,000 to his body, opened the rear door of a moving passenger jet, and stepped out into a thunderstorm 10,000 feet above the forests of the Pacific Northwest. He had no military parachute training that anyone could confirm. He had no backup plan that investigators ever found, and from that moment he simply ceased to exist. No body, no equipment, no trace. For the next 45 years, this would become the only unsolved act of air piracy in the history of American aviation, and the FBI dedicated more man-hours to it than almost any case in the Bureau's history. They called it NORJAC, Northwest Hijacking. The world would come to know him by a name that wasn't even his. It begins on the day before Thanksgiving, November 24th, 1971, at Portland International Airport. A man in his mid-40s walks up to the Northwest Orient Airlines counter. He's wearing a dark business suit, a white shirt, a thin black tie, and sunglasses. He pays cash for a one-way ticket to Seattle, gives the name Dan Cooper, and lights a cigarette while he waits to board. Nothing about him stands out. That's the point. He looks like exactly the kind of man nobody remembers seeing. He boards Flight 305, a Boeing 727, with 36 passengers and a 6-person crew, and takes seat 18C near the back of the plane. The flight is short, barely 30 minutes in the air towards Seattle, and for most of it, Cooper does nothing but sit quietly, order a bourbon and soda, and smoke. Then he motions to flight attendant Florence Schaffner, who happens to be sitting in the jump seat near him, and hands her a folded note. She assumes it's the kind of thing she's seen 100 times before. A lonely businessman passing his phone number and slips it into her pocket without even opening it. He leans toward her and says quietly, "Miss, you'd better look at that note. I have a bomb." She opens it. The handwriting is neat, almost businesslike. It outlines exactly what he wants: $200,000 in cash, 4 parachutes, and a fuel truck ready and waiting when they land in Seattle. He asks her to sit beside him, and when she does, he opens his briefcase just far enough for her to see the inside, a tangle of wires connecting to red cylindrical objects, along with what looks like a battery. She has no way to know if it's real. Neither does anyone else on that plane. It only has to look real enough to work, and it does. Schaffner relays the demand to the cockpit. The pilot radios Seattle Air Traffic Control, and within minutes the message reaches the FBI. This is happening in real time, mid-flight, with 36 passengers who have no idea anything is wrong because Cooper insists the plane keep circling rather than land immediately. He wants the money and parachutes ready before he allows the plane down. So, Flight 305 circles over Puget Sound for nearly 2 hours while, on the ground, an extraordinary scramble unfolds. Northwest Orient's president personally authorizes the payment. Seattle area banks pull together $200,000 in $20 bills, 10,000 individual bills, and FBI agents spend that time photographing and microfilming every single serial number before the money ever leaves the building. It's a detail that will matter enormously years later. The plane finally lands in Seattle after dark. Cooper allows the passengers and most of the crew to leave the aircraft in exchange for the money and the parachutes, keeping only the pilot, co-pilot, flight engineer, and one flight attendant, Tina Mucklow, aboard. He counts the ransom himself, methodically, then has the plane refueled and orders it back into the air, this time toward Mexico City, with a series of very specific, very unusual instructions. Fly low, under 10,000 feet, keep the cabin unpressurized, keep the landing gear down, fly slow, around 150 knots, and lower the rear stairway, the aft staircase unique to the Boeing 727's tail design, while still in flight. Every one of those instructions points to one conclusion: he intends to jump. Somewhere over the dense mountainous forest of southwestern Washington, in driving rain and near-zero visibility, with the cabin lights briefly dimming due to a change in air pressure, Cooper unhooks his seatbelt, and at roughly 8:13 p.m., The aircraft's tail section registers a sudden upward pitch and pressure bump, consistent with weight leaving the rear stairway. When the plane lands safely in Reno, Nevada, the remaining crew finds an empty cabin. Cooper is gone. 2 of the 4 parachutes are gone. His clip-on tie is left folded over a seat. 8 cigarette butts sit in an ashtray. That's it. That is the entirety of the physical evidence left behind by a man who had just pulled off the only unsolved skyjacking in American history. What follows is the largest air and ground manhunt the FBI had conducted up to that point. Military aircraft, ground search teams, and local volunteers comb through hundreds of square miles of dense, mountainous forest in southwest Washington for weeks. They find nothing. No body, no parachute canopy caught in trees, no briefcase. Investigators begin to question whether he could have even survived the jump at all. At night, in a storm, in a business suit and loafers with no helmet, into terrain that experienced skydivers describe as some of the most unforgiving wilderness on the West Coast. Then, in February 1980, nearly 9 years later, an 8-year-old boy named Brian Ingram is digging in the sand along a beach known as Tina Bar, on the banks of the Columbia River, preparing a campfire with his family. He uncovers a decaying, partially buried bundle of cash. When investigators examine it, the serial numbers match Cooper's ransom exactly. It's roughly $5,800 of the original $200,000 sue, a small fraction, badly deteriorated, the rubber bands long since perished. The discovery raises more questions than it answers. Tina Bar is nowhere near where investigators believed Cooper would have landed based on the flight path and wind conditions that night. Some researchers have proposed the cache could have been moved downstream over the years by dredging operations on the river. Others argue the discovery suggests Cooper's drop zone calculations were wrong from the start, that he, or the money alone, came down somewhere closer to the river than anyone initially assumed. No conclusive answer has ever been established for exactly how that money got there, separated from the rest of the ransom, while the man who took it remains completely unaccounted for. Over the decades, the FBI investigated literally hundreds of suspects. Richard McCoy, Jr., who carried out an almost identical hijacking and parachute escape just months later, was the Bureau's leading suspect for years, until that physical descriptions and skydiving expertise didn't fully match witness accounts, and he was eventually ruled out before his death in a 1974 shootout with police during an unrelated escape attempt. Kenneth Christensen, a former paratrooper and Northwest Orient flight attendant, was named by his own brother decades later after his death, based on physical resemblance and insider airline knowledge. But DNA testing was never conclusive. Dwayne Weber confessed to his wife on his deathbed in 1995, claiming to be Cooper, but fingerprint comparisons didn't match. Robert Rackstraw, a former Army pilot with a checkered legal history, was investigated heavily and publicly named by independent researchers in a popular 2016 documentary, but he denied it until his death in 2019, and the FBI never charged him. In 2009, citizen researchers working with the FBI examined Cooper's left-behind tie under an electron microscope and discovered microscopic particles of titanium and other rare metals, materials associated at the time with limited industrial and aerospace manufacturing, which some researchers argued could narrow down his possible profession. It's one of the only forensic leads the case has ever produced, and even that has never led to a name. In July 2016, after 45 years and what the Bureau itself called exhaustive efforts, the FBI officially suspended active investigation into the case, redirecting its resources toward what it described as more pressing priorities. The case wasn't declared solved, it was simply closed for lack of new evidence, though the FBI has stated it would still review any genuinely new physical evidence if it surfaced. There's one detail worth sitting with before we close this file. The man who did all of this never actually called himself D.B. Cooper. His alias on the ticket was Dan Cooper, A reporter covering the story in the chaotic hours afterward misheard or misreported the name as D.B. Cooper, and the error stuck so permanently in the press that it became the only name history has for him. The town of Ariel, Washington, near the presumed drop zone, still holds an annual D.B. Cooper Days festival every year. There's a beer named after him. Several documentaries and at least 2 films exist. An entire online community of amateur investigators continues, to this day, combing through declassified FBI files trying to do what one of the largest criminal investigations in American history could not. He took the money. He took the jump. And whoever he really was, he took that answer with him. If you've got a theory on who Cooper really was, put it in the comments. The FBI itself never closed that door completely. Subscribe, because next time, we're opening a file from 1947 that Los Angeles still hasn't been able to close either.